thank you everybody for coming. This is following on the success of the conference we had in Dunfermline at the end of July. And so I have with me in this morning session Ewen Kennedy and Yvonne Ridley. Ewen will be talking about he's a still an active lawyer, I believe.
Gave it up a while ago.
But he'll
moved over to the other side.
He'll be talking about the legal issues surrounding independence, and then we have Yvonne Ridley, still journalist? Yeah, okay, still journalist. And she'll be talking about the GRA reforms and the implications of that. In the afternoon, it will be myself speaking about EFTA and the EU. Also we should, hopefully, Tim Rideout will be with us to talk about a Scottish currency in the afternoon session. So this will probably run an hour and a half, roughly, something like that. Then we'll have lunch, and then we'll have the second session after that. So without further ado, Ewen, please hold forth.
Right, well, good morning everyone. It's nice to be back in Coatbridge. I haven't been here for a few years. Eventually found my way. The roads are a bit different, but anyway, there we are. Just to introduce myself, first of all, as Mark said, I was a lawyer for about 40 years in working in Glasgow, but I also was involved quite a bit in legal theory for a number of years at the start of my career. And when you go to university to study law, in your first year, they give you an introduction to what they call constitutional law and history, and basically it's English constitutional law and history. I quite like that, and I also quite like legal theory, so I actually continued to study that for the better part of my time there, and then I actually taught a thing called jurisprudence, which is legal theory, subsequently. So I've kind of appointed myself to know something about this, but I probably don't know as much about it as some of the people here, but I'll do my best. So I thought I would divide what I was going to say really into three sections. I thought I'd first of all run over what my understanding of the sort of English constitutional theory, which we're kind of stuck with as long as we're in the UK. And then the second bit, I thought I'd broaden it a bit and look at some of the issues that actually the Scottish Government have covered in the independent submission that they put into the Supreme Court, talking about this sort of Scottish constitutional history. And then finally I thought I would just offer a few words about the Supreme Court hearing and its relevance. So just to start the first section and about the legal theory. Funny thing about studying constitutional law is that no one ever really does it again. I mean, half a century later, it's a distant memory, and then all of a sudden you suddenly discover it's all over the news because, of course, of current issues. One of the things you notice is that when you were at university, you learned all about a man called Alba v. Dicey, D-I-C-E-Y, and no one else knew about Mr. Dicey until a couple of years ago, and now I think an awful lot of people do know about him. And the funny thing is, it's actually funny in a rather unpleasant sort of way, but the United Kingdom doesn't have a constitution. Some people will tell you that there is a constitution, but if you look for it, you find it in the writings of, you don't find it in Acts of Parliament, and you don't find it in a big declaration of independence like the Americans had. You don't find it like you have in the French Constitution. You don't find it in, for example, the post-war constitutions that, strangely enough, the United Kingdom was active. Scottish and English lawyers helped to write constitutions for the newly emerging countries. And also when countries come out from the Soviet Union, they get a written constitution, but we've got nothing like that in the UK. So really the constitution is what Mr. Rees-Mogg tells you it is. But the previous version of Mr. Rees-Mogg was Albert v. Dicey. And he's still quite relevant today because he preached, he really basically preached a sort of doctrine that had grown out of the ancient English concept that and actually King James first and sixth quite liked it as well, that the king was the vicar of God. That God had put the king in charge of you to run the show, and anything that the king did was the law, and you couldn't really argue with that. And then when there was something like a convention of nobles or the House of Lords, it really was a sort of advisory function. And also, I think probably everyone here knows, but some people may not in the wider world, we didn't really have democracy in the United Kingdom until early in the 19th century. And it really was forced on the establishment by the fact that people were actually getting pretty fed up with being told what to do all the time. And we have the things like the Weavers' riots in Glasgow, and an element in this is actually the fact that people had started to learn to read quite big time. I said in a talk we had before with Mark that Adam Smith's an interesting guy because he thought that it was a good idea, but rather different from the English system. He preached that, he was Scottish of course, and he preached that an ability to read was really good for two different things. One was that it helped people's self-development because they could start educating themselves. And the other thing, of course, was economic, because you didn't really need to read very much if all you were doing was working a plough. But when we get into the Industrial Revolution and you begin to machines and things, it's quite helpful, as my mother always used to say, when all else fails, read the instructions. So there was a sort of economic aspect to it, but in fairness to Adam Smith, he's very much maligned. He did promote the idea that it was good for people to be able to educate themselves, and of course we always had a tradition of that in Scotland. So anyway, you get to the period between about 1828 and 1832, you have a lot of, they abolished the Test Acts, which prohibited Roman Catholics from holding public appointments. Also, if you were a kind of extreme form of Protestant, you were in trouble, so they sort of tried to control the thing from the middle. They abolished that so that you could apply for jobs and serve. And then also the franchise, the first ever franchise came in 1832. Won't go into to be honest, I haven't gone into all the details of it. It's history, but it was male only, and you had to have a house. So it wasn't anything like the entire population. And as everyone here knows, it's a century later before women got the vote. So that was really the background. But this development created a problem in the 19th century because you could no longer go around pretending that the king was the vicar of God, because the people were having a bit of a say in it now. And this is where Dicey came in, because he really promoted the idea that Westminster was absolute. And no parliament could bind its successors. Obviously, if you've got absolute power, you can't bind what your children or the people who follow along afterwards might do. So it is it's an enabling concept, but it's also a disabling concept, because it means that when we read on the front page of the Daily Record in 2014, a thing called a vow, it's actually not worth the paper it's printed on, because they can say one thing, but the legal theory, Mr. Dicey's legal theory, says that, no, sorry, next week, next year, different parliament, we can change it. After 2014, they decided to kind of make us all feel a bit better about ourselves, so they enacted a thing called the Scotland Act, and I'm just going to read the first section of it. Says that the Scottish government are a permanent part of the United Kingdom. So they use the word permanent, but they said that with regard to the reason why they were doing this was to signify the commitment of the Parliament and the government of the United Kingdom to the Scottish Parliament. Now, actually, that was the Parliament that existed in 2016, and as far as I can recall, we're on the third Parliament since then, and that was the government that existed in 2016, and we're now on the fourth government since 2016. So it just didn't mean anything, and there was a case already that went through the Supreme Court on the ramifications of Brexit, and it was whether Scots could be required to be consulted about the Brexit business. And of course this Section 1 of the Scotland Act was a prominent part of what the then Lord Advocate was presenting to the United Kingdom Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, strictly correctly in terms of law, said, yep, forget it. It's not worth the parliamentary paper that it's printed on. So you can ignore Scotland, and I think some of us got a wee bit concerned when a long time ago Billy Connolly described it as a pretend wee parliament, but he was kind of right. So anyway, that's the historical situation. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk about was a court case that's referred to quite a lot, and that is McCormick, John McCormick. John McCormick was a Glasgow lawyer. He put forward, he was really at the front of a movement for home rule rather than independence in the early 1950s. And when the recently deceased Queen came in, he challenged the numbering, because of course England had a Queen Elizabeth the first, and Scotland didn't have. So he took an action in the Court of Session, and there were two people raised it. One was John McCormick and the other was an unnamed student, and that was actually Ian Hamilton, the Stone of Destiny guy. Ian was a student at the time. I'll tell you later, but I did meet him once at a student party. He was an interesting guy, and he was absolutely steaming. But he'd just come back from Africa, and anyway, he'd been working for an African country, which is now actually, I think, Zambia, and he had to leave in rather a hurry, so he was quite an interesting fellow. Anyway, the case went to the Court of Session, the Scottish Court, not any kind of Supreme Court, and the judgment was given by Lord President Cooper, and this judgment people quote it and they misquote it all the time. But basically, and in fact, I won't waste time by reading the whole thing out, but basically, there's two separate paragraphs in the judgment, and we can put them online later. The first one, he refers to Dicey, and he actually quotes a bit from Dicey, where Dicey says that it's the law, it's the law, it's the law. Parliament is absolute, can do what it wants, and the only thing that might cause a problem with this would be if the Scotch people revolted, So really, he was saying the only thing that's going to put a stop to this at the end of the day is some kind of revolution, and that was actually from Dicey. But the second thing which Lord Cooper said, which I think is actually really very important, is that he said that, and I think he was quite sympathetic to Scottish home rule, if not independence. He said, I think there is another route out of this, and he said it's through the International Court of Justice in The Hague. So I mean, we're talking in 1951. 71 years ago, you've got a judge saying there is actually an escape route. So I think that really is quite interesting. So it's a very simple. It's not really a legal proposition. It's just a statement of common sense that there's never been a part of a country that has left consistently with the domestic law of that country. It just doesn't happen. I mean, Marx told me the other day his ancestors, I think, went across with the Ark, or they were early settlers to the United States.
From Holland.
They went from Holland. Yeah, I thought they might have gone through it was a bit after that time. But the Americans declare independence. You've got several years of war, and we won't even go into the Irish situation. It just doesn't happen. It's consistent with the domestic law of the country, but the international law could be a different thing. So we'll have a look at that. And this is where we've been reading a lot, and we've all been reading a lot just now about the claim of right and the Declaration of Our Growth and things like that. There's no doubt at all that before the Treaty of Union, Scotland had quite a different tradition. And I think it's probably true to say that if the king wasn't really performing, you got yourself a different king. You either killed the last one, or you certainly, there was an element of respect for the people, even though the people didn't have a vote. And the issue really is how that historical material plays out in the current context. And the way I see it, it's very, very good background, because it shows that we had a separate tradition. We were very, very clearly an independent state, and we had a different constitutional tradition. Personally, I think what's of more relevance today is the more recent stuff, where in the Edinburgh Agreement it was signed that it would always be open to the Scottish people to determine their future at a future vote. If the 2014 one didn't work out, there was nothing that was going to stop it from happening. And more recent things than that, I think, obviously we've got the United Nations declares that there is a principle of self-determination, and you need to show that you are a nation, which we can do. So there's quite a number of things that are more recent. But I see the historical stuff, claim of right. I probably might disagree a bit with some of the people who are really promoting it and trying to give it perhaps a greater value. It doesn't really have a value in the domestic legal setup, but it would have a very significant value in an international context. And updating a bit on this, 2021, there's a Professor Weller, who's I think at the University College London or London School of Economics. And he's a very well respected, very well known international lawyer, and he's no supporter of Scottish independence. But he has been saying for some years now, I think, that it was quite widely publicised in the press a year or so ago, that the route is through the World Court, the International Court of Justice. And I'll just say on this topic, the court was set up. It's got nothing to do with the European Union, and it's now under United Nations, but it was originally under the Old League of Nations. It dates from soon after the First World War, basically a number of states signed up to it at the beginning, and the ones that promoted it agreed in advance that if they were ever involved in a dispute, that would go to the court. They committed to the jurisdiction of the court in advance. Subsequently, if you had, and I think the example that's happened a few times is you've got a couple of countries, like maybe a couple of countries in Africa, and they've got a boundary dispute. They agree to go to that court on an ad hoc basis. So each of them signs up to that particular court case. So it's like a kind of arbitration that they agree. But the United Kingdom's not in that situation. They agreed in advance, so they would have a job. They probably actually have to withdraw from the court altogether if they wanted to block the International Court of Justice structure ruling on it. And just finally on this subject, I would say that I have yet to hear any unionist politician saying categorically that Scots can never, ever, ever have independence. They always tell us it's something like it's once in a lifetime, or it's not just right now, and we just had another pandemic, and then there's a Brexit's gone, and oh, we did it, yeah, okay. There's always an excuse, but they never actually say, no, you're just there, you're captives for the rest of time. Doesn't matter how long how you vote, we've got you. They don't say that, and that's a recognition that we have the right. So that's how I see the second part of what I'm saying today. And finally, the Supreme Court. I'm frankly completely baffled as to why this has gone to the Supreme Court. It's a complete mystery. Did they not read what Lord Cooper said, 1951? The judges themselves are a bit baffled by it, because they say, why didn't you pass the Act first? And I mean, there's an argument about prematurity. I actually think they are going to make a ruling, because I don't think that they would go to the trouble of sitting there and having, reading all the papers and sitting there and saying, oh, oops, we couldn't hear this in the first place because it was premature. Judges don't like doing that. They're going to make a decision. So one of the arguments that this sort of James Eady guy, who I think belongs to the same London class as most of the judges, they're all on first name terms, of course, doesn't necessarily mean he's going to win the case, but it's just a wee point mentioned in passing. Just as when the BBC report it, they don't mention that Dorothy Bain is also a King's Counsel. So James Eady, KC Dorothy Bain. Ooh, what's she? Did she just bring the coffee in? She's actually of more seniority than Sir James Eady, there we are. I've got to say, a wee bit of a puzzle. If I was the government and was going to appoint a Lord Advocate, I would kind of say, well, one of the things this government's actually quite keen on happens, you might not have heard of it, the Scottish independence. So, have you got any views about that, Dorothy? Do you think this is... Oh, no, my husband and I are unions. My husband's a judge, and so, we couldn't possibly support... Well, I'm really sorry, but next candidate, please. What's her name? Only rang, and she said, "Oh yes, I'm actually, I'm up for it." I mean, if you did a poll of Scots lawyers, you'd find a lot of them would say that Scotland could hold a referendum. It's not a sort of out of the way point of view. So they've picked someone who has been unable to present the argument. And the argument really shouldn't have been presented in the first place, because they should just have done something else, because it's not going to happen through domestic law. So I'm sorry to be pessimistic, but we can broaden the discussion later, but that's how I see things.
Thank you. Before going on to Yvonne, I just wanted to point out the Kosovo case from 2010, which essentially, which was a question in the International Court of Justice as to whether under international law Kosovo could unilaterally declare independence. And one of the major submissions was from the British or the UK judge, basically saying the argument, advancing the argument that that domestic law could, if it was a case like Scotland, for example, or Kosovo or whatever, where you're part of a broader nation state in whatever form, that declaring independence could never be subject to domestic law by definition. Of course, the UK is never going to allow anybody in any place legally. I mean, it's been that you don't control 25% of the world by allowing countries to secede. So it's just a point that we do need to bring this into the international arena and to get broader support abroad for it, because it won't be it's very difficult to get it under domestic law, because they're not going to let Scotland go. It's too much of a cash cow. Anyway, so on to Yvonne. She was going to talk about the Gender Recognition Act and the recent events which.
Yeah, I mean, a few of you might be wondering, well, what has this got to do with independence? But it actually is very important. We've just had, or the SNP has just had its largest ever...
Sorry, just very quickly, we'll take questions on both subjects after your intervention.
But the SNP have just suffered their largest ever revolt over the Gender Recognition Act, with 9 MSP SNP members actually refusing to allow the government in Holyrood to whip them into falling in line with the desires of a policy which has become so toxic and so corrosive. it's actually driving some people away from the focus of independence. So that's why I'm discussing it today. If you're thinking, you know, what the hell has it got to do with independence? I mean, a lot has happened since my last memorable trip to the Eagle, and in fact now I'm the Alba Party's women's convener, although my views might not necessarily fall in line with theirs, although I can't think that there'd be a problem, but obviously I'm saying that. Look, we women, that's those of us with a cervix, represent 51% of the country, and we gave birth to the other 49%. So I think that this issue on gender is very important. Now, you look like a bright lot. You do know that men have penises and women don't.
What?
Sorry to say this, but it's something genuinely that Nicola Sturgeon, Patrick Harvey, Sir Keir Starmer, and a host of other political leaders are struggling with at the moment. None of them will answer a direct question about what a woman is. Should we be electing people to represent us in Holyrood and Westminster if they don't know what a woman is? I'm not sure how many of you were watching the news a few days ago, but the SNP Green Coalition ruling Holyrood these days refused a free vote to our MSPs during the gender recognition reform debate. I'm told that Labour and the Lib Dems also denied their MSPs a free vote. So these politicians were all whipped essentially and told how to vote. Well, as I said before, 9 politicians from the SNP refused to be whipped, and while 2 abstained, another 7 voted against the debate, which wants men to be able to self-identify as women without having to go through any medical expertise or certification. I'll come back to the nitty-gritty of that later, but in the meantime, the fallout remains to be seen from the debate, because the whip was not withdrawn from the heroic 9. If Nicola Sturgeon had done that, if she'd carried out her threat to withdraw the whip, she would have lost her majority in Holyrood. So despite the threats to their political careers, she didn't go ahead, which means that she's sort of lost that ultimate threat. You know, could she be now viewed as a lame duck in Holyrood? I really genuinely think, and it's not wishful thinking, I genuinely think this is the beginning of the end, folks, for Nicola.
Let's hope so.
And her bonkers plan to reform the Gender Recognition Act. There are 5 stages that this reform has to go through, and last week saw the first stage. So if you work out the maths, if 9 have already had the guts to stand up and say no, that will then encourage their fellow MSPs to revolt at stage 2, stage 3. We might not even get to a stage 5. But now that the whip has not been withdrawn from the SNPs who revolted, it certainly means that others will be emboldened and stand up to the First Minister and her bullies. I'm not even sure, as I say, that these reforms will reach the 5th stage before the whole thing implodes, because as people find out exactly what it means, they're getting more and more angry.
You may be getting to this, but if you could explain in a little more detail about what it does actually mean and Yeah.
Yeah, I will do. I want to name the 7, though, heroic MSPs, and if they are your MSPs, please write to them and say thank you. You know, I think that they'll be under quite a bit of fire. The first one was Ash Reagan, who resigned from the post of Community Safety Minister just hours before Thursday's vote. And she said her conscience would not allow her to support the government plans. So she voted no, and she was joined by Stephanie Callaghan, Fergus Ewen, Kenneth Gibson, Ruth Maguire, John Mason, Michelle Thompson, and the 2 SNP abstainers were Annabel Ewing and Jim Fairley. And it took guts to do what they did. This showed incredible courage. Labour's Rosie Duffield, on the other side of the border, she's a Westminster MP, is equally courageous, and I want to mention her because about 2 or 3 years ago, Rosie Duffield was being hailed in the ranks of Labour for turning a centuries-old Tory seat from blue to red down south, but now, if you mention Rosie Duffield's name, people look the other way, they run the other way. She couldn't even get into the Labour Party conference, and that's because she blotted her copybook by stating only women have a cervix. When she was arguing that misogyny should be a hate crime, she was applauded and everybody was Team Rosie. Then she started talking about feminism and protecting women. By women, I mean adult females, those biological creatures in possession of a vagina and XX chromosomes. I know I'm insulting your intelligence, but you know, this is, if somebody had said to me 5 years ago, we'd be having this discussion, I'd say you're completely bonkers. But that is what we've been reduced to. Duffield has said her feminist and gender critical beliefs mean that while I've always fully supported the rights of all trans people to live freely as they choose, I do not accept self-ID as a passport for male-bodied biological men to enter protected spaces for biological women. And that is at the nub of this. I don't think anybody in this room could care less if a man chooses to wear a dress or not, or wants to call himself a woman or not. I don't think anybody would care. But if he then said, well, I have a right to go into woman-only spaces, I think a few of us would bristle at that. Nobody's saying trans women are sex pests, far from it. But there are sex predators out there who will take advantage of these self-ID laws. And Nicola Sturgeon says, well, you know, we have laws to protect women. Is that before or after she's been raped? You know, there's no reason to put any women or children at risk. Like many of us women who won't wished. Duffield has been called a transphobe and a homophobe for good measure. Starmer is still under pressure to withdraw the party whip. But of course the climate is changing now, and I think these leaders are wishing that they hadn't gone down a particular path and they're looking for a way back out. But what I find repugnant is the absence of Labour MPs rallying to Duffield's defence. What happened to the sisterhood when she was decrying misogyny? Labour's response is to do anything other than defend her, and Starmer's silence on the matter suggests he's quite happy that Duffield felt obliged to stay away from the party conference. And I think this is the attitude of the Scottish Labour leader as well, but trying to pin them down on this subject is like trying to nail jelly to the wall. The behaviour of these leaders is shameful. Under Starmer, under Sturgeon, under Sarwar, under Patrick Harvey. Patrick Harvey, I mean, he just hates women, full stop. And whoever's running the Lib Dems these days. The whole mob is full of their grand rhetoric of inclusion, diversity and feminism, are the same herd that bully and abuse women like me who stand up for women's rights. They're all clambering over each other like frogs in a bucket to reform the Gender Recognition Act to allow for gender self-identification. So when they come knocking on your doors, which inevitably they will at the next elections, whether it's council, Holyrood or Westminster, ask them about the GRA reforms and if it's fair that a trans woman can join a women-only candidate list. This is what we're wrestling with at the moment. The Scottish Government says it simply wants to simplify the process of obtaining a gender recognition certificate, which will enable people to change their legal gender without the need to obtain a medical diagnosis. So if a man wants to declare himself to be a woman, he can. And similarly, if a woman wants to call herself a man, she can. It sounds simple enough, and some of you might be thinking, well, you know, what's the harm? There's nothing new about transsexuality. It goes back hundreds of years when it became accepted that folk could adopt gender identities different from their biological reality. But it has now become a toxic political hot potato, and it will bring down the SNP unless they wake up quickly. I was standing outside Holyrood with a lobby of women about this, and one of the women said, "This to me is more important than independence." I don't know. I tend to think that independence is the priority. But I just thought how frightening this is, that somebody is thinking about walking away from the independence battle and focusing on this. And this is why I'm talking about it now, because we have to get this legislation stopped, ripped up, thrown out, and focus on the real battle, whether it's in the courts, in Parliament, wherever it's going to be held. In fact, I have a feeling, and you might have a view on this, Ewen, that this may also end up in the Supreme Court. But this is what is focusing the mind of the SNP, this legislation, not independence, which seems to have taken a back seat, much to the frustration of decent people left within the party. If the Scottish Government forges ahead with this gender madness, it will mean that anyone in Scotland can define themselves as a woman simply as a matter of choice, and in a matter of months, thus ignoring the biology. Again, you might think, well, what's the big deal? Well, it has serious implications for female-only spaces. We women need to have privacy from men in bathrooms, in changing rooms, health and beauty spas. I was talking to a beautician about it the other day, and she said, well, it doesn't really bother me and it doesn't affect me. I said, oh really? I said, what if a trans woman comes into you for a Brazilian wax and they haven't been surgically, whatever it is, you know, a fully intact man? And she went, oh no. And I said, you're being transphobic now, or that is how the argument will be. There's prisons as well where some of the most vulnerable women are. If a man wants to self-identify as a woman, and instead of going into a male prison, he could end up in a female prison. So there are issues of personal safety. And as I said before, no one's saying trans women are likely to be sex offenders, but there are male sex offenders and other predators who would see the opportunity and seize on the opportunity of gender self-identification as a route to accessing women-only spaces. We've already received reports of traumatised women and girls being sexually assaulted in gender-neutral changing rooms in department stores and shops. Primark has now decided just a few days ago to scrap its unisex changing rooms amid the growing backlash, because there have been reports of men dressed as women exposing their male genitalia to women and young girls in the changing room. Others have been reported of being sexually abused and molested by these men posing as women. Apart from the obvious physical threat to women, the Scottish Government has gone one step further by trying to erase the term women from its literature. And you can check yourself when you go back home tonight and have a look at the health literature, the government literature on the website. The term woman is hard to find anywhere. We've been erased. Apparently we're now called people who menstruate, pregnant people, abortion seekers, chest feeders, birthing parents. As I say, the term woman is being erased from Scottish Government official documents. I doubt very much if many voters would even have known about this had it not been for a few heroic feminists who have been fighting back over this clear erosion of the rights of women. It has hit the news lately because high-profile people like J.K. Rowling have stood up and said they've had enough. And she's had death threats and all sorts of nonsense and threats to her personal safety because of it. Court cases taken by individuals, such as a woman called Maya Forstater. She was up outside Holyrood the other week as well, joining in the lobby. She's been helpful in making it clear that gender-critical views are protected by freedom of speech and should be respected. But the UK and the Scottish governments and other governments around the world think that have in the past thought that they knew better, but the UK government is now rethinking its position. Other governments in Europe who once went down the route have all retreated from reforming the Gender Recognition Act to accept self-ID of gender. Everybody's changing their minds. Sadly, not the Scottish Government. It's still forging ahead with this madness. Astonishingly, Nicola Sturgeon says women's concerns about the reforms she is proposing are not valid. You know, she has the nerve to call herself a feminist down to her fingertips, and yet she says that my views, your views, not valid. It's unbelievable. Sadly, this arrogant and dismissive attitude and refusal to even just pause and reconsider reforms by Scotland's First Minister has led to bullying of gender-critical feminists by trans rights activists. And I happen to know that there are a number of trans women who are embarrassed by the aggression shown by trans rights activists. They're not doing any favours to their cause at all. More alarmingly, some of Sturgeon's own MSPs have been gagged, while some clinicians have been pushed into forcing vulnerable young people down irreversible routes as a consequence of this political pressure. In the last decade, there has been a mini explosion in the number of children, particularly teenage girls, who have developed gender dysphoria. It's a very real thing. They really think that they're living in the wrong sex. This belief of a mismatch between their biological sex and their gender identity is leading to depression and anxiety, resulting in harmful personal impact. Tragically, many of these vulnerable young people have already been pushed down a pathway of transition, some being prescribed puberty blockers without fully realising the impact of early use of cross-sex hormones. This sort of medication can cause irreversible physical damage to young people's bodies, and now there's a growing number of detransitioners who've made irreversible changes to their bodies and they regret it and they want to raise the issue. But the Scottish Government has shown a distinct lack of willing to listen to these people. We now know that parents of gender dysphoric children are told, look, you've got a choice. Either allow your child to transition or risk them committing suicide. There is this endlessly repeated figure of 48% of young trans people have attempted suicide. But according to journalist and author Helen Joyce, that figure is highly dubious and at best is based on the responses of 27 British trans people. That's what they've based this on. They're telling parents 48% of your children will commit suicide. And then this is what it's based on, a poll of 27 people. It's a tiny self-selecting sample, and yet it has become the basis for wildly inaccurate political statements which have tumbled recklessly from the mouths of politicians who, quite frankly, should have done their research and should know better. Many female politicians in the Alba party, as well as other gender-critical men and women, have been bombarded with horrific online abuse. Yet despite all of this, Sturgeon and her Equality Secretary, Shona Robertson, will plough ahead with stage 2 of the bill, despite the concerns of many organisations, including the much respected Equality and Human Rights Commission. Ignoring all advice, it seems these two are determined to turn Scotland into a gender tourism destination to non-Scots who would only have to live here for 3 months and then they could apply to change their birth ID if this controversial legislation is allowed to go ahead, to abolish the need for a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria. It would also cut the time in which someone must live in their acquired gender from 2 years to only a matter of months. If the Scottish Government continues on this disastrous route, it will display a lack of understanding on both the definition of a woman and the operation of the Equality Act. So now you know why women won't wish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. And so I'd like to open up in questions, comments, just let the discussion evolve as it.
Could I start off with just a couple of comments, which I've been noting down while Yvonne was speaking. I was actually thinking that one of the things that is going on right now, and I saw it the other day, was that the police were looking for a person after someone had been sexually assaulted. They couldn't say that they were looking for a man. They said they were looking for a person. So it's, we're beginning to see that coming through already. Yvonne mentioned that this might end up in the Supreme Court. I think it probably will. basically, Joanna Cherry's always writing about this. There are completely separate protected characteristics of sex and gender. It's as simple as that. And while they're unable to define a woman, actually, I've never yet seen a definition of gender either. I mean, gender really seems to be about what people might make of it, and there just isn't a definition of gender. At least with sex, you've got the chromosome. There is science, and then of course people will say, well, the science can change. Yeah, of course, there's a principle of non-verifiability with science. It's, the latest science is the correct version until someone proves it's wrong. But the correct version at the moment is that there are basically two sexes, and it's chromosomal. But gender is no one's tried a definition of that. And I noticed, I was watching one of the committees in the Scottish Parliament dealing with this, and a very young woman, I'm sorry, I'm not decrying the fact that she's young, but she didn't have a huge amount of criminal court experience, I don't think, having never been in the criminal court. But she said, it's all right, there's an offence of making a false declaration. Now, if someone had come into my office and said they were accused of making a false declaration, I said, what's the declaration about? Well, I said I was a woman, and I said, well, why did you do that? He said, well, I felt like a woman that day. So he said, it's not a false declaration. And you can't, I mean, the idea that anyone could actually be found guilty of this very curious crime of declaring themselves to be something that politicians say you can't define, it's completely and totally nuts. So I think this quite probably will go to the Supreme Court, either at the instance of, which is very unfortunate, a pressure group raising hard-earned money through crowdfunding to take a highly expensive challenge that really shouldn't be required, or possibly the UK government will take steps to challenge the legislation because of the cross-border issues, because I think the cross-border issues are just absolutely, we've seen it before, hundreds of years ago. People used to come to Gretna Green to get married because they could do it without their parents' consent, and then later they used to come to Scotland for a divorce because England didn't have divorce through the courts and Scotland did have. So you come up here for your, in those days you come up here for your sort of your sexual liberation, one might say. And I can see something like this happening in the future. The other thing, I just say that I believe there were 5 detransitioning women wanted to give evidence to the committee, and they refused. They said they didn't have time to listen to them, and then they said later that there was no evidence. So there's a complete dishonesty at a political level. So that's my comment.
Questions? Please, go ahead.
Does the panel foresee any detransitioners suing the Scottish Government in the future?
Well, there is legal action already being taken against a clinic in London, which has now been earmarked for closure, and that involves a sizable number of parents and detransitioners who feel as though they should have been given more counselling, and that the medical decisions taken were wrong. I mean, these blockers, puberty blockers, I don't know how many of you here can remember the Olympic gymnastic champion Olga Corbett, tiny little shrimp of a thing, amazing athlete. She was put on puberty blockers, and there was international outrage because she was kept trapped in this body. And some of the side effects of puberty blockers are infertility, and a whole range of lifelong ailments that need medication. And you know, there has to be, I think, a more common sense approach taken to try and help these young people. And I think one of the things that has upset lesbians in particular is that young girls who are feeling attracted to other young girls think that, oh gosh, I'm in the wrong body, I should be a man. When in fact, through some basic counselling, they would realise that there's nothing wrong with them. They're just physically attracted to the same sex. And unfortunately, some of these young girls have been pushed down the transitioning route. And this is why you have clashes and women like Joanna Cherry standing up saying that this sort self-IDing is dangerous.
Others?
I'm going to make myself really unpopular here, and I'm not even going to state which side of the debate I'm on. I'm an Alba member, and I'm not disagreeing with a word that you've said, but what I'm thinking is this is the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group, and I'm not sure the relevance of the debate or the discussion has to this, and I don't think I'm on my own. And Yvonne, I'm not taking away from a word of what you've said, but I don't know that that's what we were expecting a debate on the Gender Recognition Act when we came today.
Well, it shouldn't dominate today's discussion, and you know, I agree
it's
with
too
you.
divisive, and we're here about Scottish
But,
sovereignty.
well, we're saying it's divisive, but when I am standing with people campaigning outside Holyrood and somebody says to me, I'm dropping the fight for independence because I'm so upset about this, that causes me concern. And
it causes me concern too.
And a friend of mine in London was appalled when two of her lesbian friends had become so upset about this whole business that they're now thinking of voting Tory.
Well,
Because
I just don't think the discussion of the debate belongs under this umbrella. That's all. Yvonne, I'm not disagreeing with you, and I firmly uphold any LGBT, but whatever rights. But I'm not sure that it's for this. This.
We do actually have Tim Ryder on his way over to talk about currency. So,
And I'll be speaking about FTEU after that. So
no, it's fine. You know, but it is important because we need to sort it out so that we can focus on important things like currency and
I'm not
the
saying
SSRG.
I would never say it, but for me personally, nothing is more important than Scotland regaining her independence.
I'm going to try and tie both things up here because if there's not an ISP person or an Alba person standing in my region, I will not vote SNP because of the women's issue. But this is where we come back to Salvo. How do we hold these people accountable to what they're doing to our country and pulling the independence into?
I might just add a comment here. Just thinking just now, I don't want to tell you lots and lots of stories about who used to come to student parties, but I remember being at a student party in about 1967, something like that. And many years ago. And a funny wee guy came, and he was Anthony J.C. Kerr. I don't know if anyone know who I'm talking about. He was a wee fellow. He was in motorcycle leathers, and he had he was all dressed up. He'd actually arrived on a motorbike from, I think, Hoyk, and how he ever managed to drive himself home. He left about 3 o'clock in the morning, but he'd gone there for a purpose, and it was to tell. There were a lot of these events were really very, very political. And he said, I'm really quite right-wing. I said, I'm a kind of Scottish nationalist Tory. And he said, I will work with Marxists and communists and Labour Party people to get Scottish independence. And he said that the minute independence is achieved, and this is high up in the SNP in the 1960s, said we will immediately dissolve. He said, we're not interested in policies. We're not interested in doing, we're not interested in whether you want nationalisation or anything. We disagree with each other on all these issues. We just want independence. And that just sort of triggered my brain just now, because the way I see this gender thing is, what the hell has it got to do with independence? Why does it become so incredibly important to some of these people? And why I didn't vote for Emma Roddick on the Highlands and Islands list. I live in Argyll, by the way, because I had Andy Whiteman to vote for, because he'd left the Green Party over the gender issue. And I thought, well, maybe Andy's got a chance. Well, he didn't have a chance because people up there didn't know him. But Emma puts out tweets saying, you all voted for this.
No, we didn't.
And we didn't. We voted, anyone that voted for her voted for independence. And it wasn't even in the manifesto. So, I mean, what I'm really saying is I'm really kind of, there is a really important point here. What are they going to get sidetracked with next? Now, slightly less visible than that, I actually don't like the economic policies. I think that if we started looking at, if we actually took the trouble to kind of just work out what the hell do these people really stand for. I mean, they've got a guy that's the Duke of the Clues factor basically writing economic policies.
Yes.
Wait a minute! This is absolutely ridiculous. People aren't going to, if people really knew, I mean, they vote SNP because they want independence, and then they get gender, they'll get massive privatisation, they're getting the offshore wind sold off. You just wait for it. What's going to come down the road next?
And Murray Foote as the chief media advisor, former head of the
it's quite scary. So there was a lot of sense in what that old guy, Anthony J.C. Kerr, said all these years ago.
It is like playing whack-a-mole while we're sort of on this road to independence, and we're all trying to focus on independence, and these things are cropping up, but some of them it's too dangerous just to not, to ignore them. No, I mean, you and I are in agreement, but and I guess that that's why I'm here today. And it was interesting your point, because so many people have said to me, I really don't know who I'm going to vote for, because in the next elections, whether it's council, Holyrood or Westminster, because I can't vote SNP. And so I guess we're going to have to step up to the plate, each and every one of us, and if there isn't somebody from one of the independence parties other than SNP, then we're going to have to stand up. And one of the arguments will be, if you do that, you'll split the vote. But there has to be a point where we do make a stand and take back control of independence and get it back in the hands of people who love the country, want to see the country go ahead and develop and improve and have its own currency. Personally, I would go with the groat just to get away from Westminster, but I'm sure that Tim Laptout will have something more important to say about that.
I would like to just jump in very quickly and say what you said earlier, Ewen, was a new government, a new broom, sorry, with my voice. A new government, a new broom, we can sweep aside any laws that we don't want. That's what we need to have, that power, though. We need to have independence.
I've got a question for you. The Supreme Court, which may give an answer after Christmas or around Christmas. So what are the chances of a referendum next October if we're not going to actually have the answer till December?
Well, I can give you my answer. I don't see there being a referendum next year. I was actually going to say, well, we could actually do a hands up. Who thinks there's going to be a referendum next year?
Okay, who thinks we're going to have a referendum next year?
No one. I just add to that, the thing that sort of scares me about it is that we've got so far down these side tracks of gender and other things just now, and we've got so many monumentally incompetent people in positions of power just now, and highly competent people who are not in positions of power, that it actually scares the daylights out of me when we're going to get this kind of reverse back out again. I can't, I really, you've got to try and somehow keep a sense of humour about this, but it'd be very, very easy to get extremely depressed about it, because there just seem to be so many things that are going in the wrong direction. On the timescale, it's not going to be Christmas, because Lord Hope said, I was listening to him in the car radio a couple of weeks ago when I was driving down to Glasgow for another meeting. He said, I think they can get a judgment out in 6 to 8 weeks. Now, Lord Reid is one of the Scottish judges in the Supreme Court. He started off, he'd heard that. He started off the hearing by saying, we've got 8,000 bits of paper to read, and we're not going to hurry about this, so Lord Hope, sorry pal, you really were a bit optimistic. It's going to be many months. I was even worried about it, because sometimes, I mean, they know how they're going to decide. This is the thing that bothers me. They know which way they're going to go, because they probably knew before they ever heard Sir James Ridley and Don Devane. But they won't disclose that until they're ready to put out a judgment. I thought sometimes if a matter's really pressing, they'll put out a note of how they've decided, and then the reasons come later. But I don't think there's any indication they're going to do that. So no one's going to be able to organise. And then, of course, Mike Russell's going to tell us that, well, we've taken so long to come through the Supreme Court, and it's a bit of a mess now, there's only a fortnight left. Or, oops, 19th of October, oh dear, it was last month. So I can see that. Whether there's some grand plan at work here, who knows? Would you start a court case knowing you were going to lose it with some kind of ulterior motive, like say that's the English, that's the Supreme Court, oh look what they've done to us. No, I don't see it. I think it's just a shambles. I don't see a referendum next year.
Well, I was told by a friend who's still in the SNP, and there are a lot of decent people in the SNP, and he said, oh, we have to go down the Supreme Court route because there is a grand plan, and we know it will fail, we know it will be paid out, but that's when we go to Europe. And I just looked and said, well, if that's the case, why wouldn't you go to the European courts straight away? Oh, because you can't, you've got to go through this.
You've got to
first.
extinguish all of the other domestic remedies before you go on to this.
So that is the general optimistic view of a lot of the decent people still left in the SNP.
And what would
Who
that be?
still have this trust in the leadership.
And would that be the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, or the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights?
It really couldn't be. It couldn't possibly be the European Court, because of Brexit. I mean, I think there's a lot of. I mean, obviously you're going to be talking about this afternoon, but I think there's a lot of people think that you just sort of knock on the door and go straight back into the European Union. But you're going to be telling us it's not as simple as that. But at the moment we're out, so there's no access to the European Court.
But under the UN, the ICJ,
We don't need to go through any.
the International Court of Justice is under the UN, not under the
That's right. I mean, you wouldn't need to go through a whole load of domestic courts before you got to the World Court, the International Court of Justice, because it's talking international law. It's not an appeal court for domestic courts. You start off there and you finish there. I think your friends are through.
Any other questions before we adjourn for lunch? Please, Patrick.
I just wanted to ask, in the last election, because I'm only interested in independence, right? That's all, just independence, that's it. Really, I think that's what we need to be focused on. Get our independence, we sort the rest out later. I'm saying this, but at the last election, they were saying the best chance of getting the most members of the Scottish Parliament at that time, and as independence people, was to vote SNP Green, or SNP Alba, SNP, or SNP Green Alba. So I was a bit confused with that. And so I decided to vote SNP Green, because there wasn't an Alba candidate on my list anyway. But the point I'm trying to say is this. When Nicola Sturgeon says the next general election, which will be coming within 2 years, probably sooner, and she says she'll make it a de facto referendum where if the majority of people in Scotland vote for independence parties, that means Scotland should be independent. Can that actually happen?
As far as I understand it, she was proposing that, that either there'll be a Section 30, that's not going to happen, then she'll put it to the Supreme Court, we're waiting on that, and if failing that they would use a Westminster general election, as a de facto referendum, but they hadn't thought it really well out. That's the problem. And even Margaret Thatcher conceded that if there was a majority of pro-independence MPs elected, that would be sufficient to declare independence. And so that should have been what the standard was, and it hasn't been elaborated at this point. But then she announced that, and then the next day they were interviewing John Swinney, and they were saying, "Oh, do you mean a majority of seats or a majority of votes?" "Oh, majority of votes." You've already given the game away. I mean, they just haven't thought it out. And so, we at our conference in Dunfermline, the SSRG conference in Dunfermline, we were fortunate enough to have both Douglas Chapman from the SNP and Neil Hanby from Alba on the same stage, and they both agreed that any possibility of that happening has to be within a court. It can't just be vote SNP and you'll get independence. It has to be a ISP, and Alba and SNP working together to put over kind of an overall pro-Scotland list that they could, where they're not competing against each other in particular constituencies. And then this whole idea, it has to be a majority of seats. A majority of pro-independence parties. No, it doesn't. The British are able to make up their constitution as they go along. Why can't Scots, collectively decide, okay, majority of seats, yeah, we're independent. There's no reason why that can't be done. But again, I just don't think they've thought it out.
Well, I think that you're absolutely right. I think it's actually I think when you try to work out in practice how it would work, there's two possibilities. Because one is the Westminster UK general election, which is completely out with control of anyone in Scotland. I mean, it's entirely down to Mr. Sunny.
And a different franchise as well. There's no
Yeah.
16 or 8,
Yeah.
16 to 17-year-olds, and your EU citizens are can't vote. Yeah.
So if you take that one first of all, I mean, they might do it tomorrow, so no one's ready. But then you've got to work out. There's a number of different political parties now, and they don't. They're not. I'm not going to say that they're not speaking. That it's both sides. There's one side that's not speaking to any of the SNP are frankly not talking to other parties. Maybe the other parties are not talking to them. The main thing is they're not talking to each other. But how would you work it out? You would actually need to sort of divvy out all the seats in Scotland, and you say, right, well, Alba, you get, Kenny and Alex Salmon maybe would stand, and Handy, might give them 3, and then ISP give them a couple, and then someone starts another party.
And then it's sort of like contesting
Just
the
to finish what I'm trying to say, you've then got local activists who've been delivering leaflets all their life for the SNP, and you say, right, this time you're delivering leaflets for the ISP, and you say, what's the ISP? I don't like them. So it hasn't been thought through. I mean, there would be a war at ground level among local activists who would not be willing, and some would actually insist on standing as independents and this, that and the other thing. So the Westminster thing is hopeless. The other possibility which I saw mooted the other day was that you trigger, you all get together and you trigger a Holyrood election that then requires the political parties all to get together. And the same kind of thing, but at least it's got a couple of advantages. You get 16 and 17-year-olds get a vote, and you're in control of the timing of it, and you can trigger it, because if everyone resigns at once, if everyone resigns, then they'll just help. You've actually triggered it, so it's the time scale's under your own control. But time and time again, we see results misrepresented by London. They say that, Nicola Sturgeon's not got a majority this time because there's some green people, so it doesn't count. And then of course, actually, the gender issue comes back into this again, I'm sorry to say, because you've got to say, some people, from London, you can say, well, some people would have voted for these pro-independence parties because of the gender issues. So, it isn't a proper test. So you'd actually need to have, everyone will have a manifesto.
Independence.
Yeah, just that. And so how can you possibly achieve it when the people in charge of some of those parties are having difficulty in sorting out the manifestos? It's actually a bit of a nightmare.
The reality is the last Holyrood elections, where Nicola Sturgeon was saying both votes SNP, that was such bad advice to give, because if people had voted one SNP, one Alba or one ISP, it would have shifted the whole landscape of what Holyrood looks like today. It would have at least 30 unionist seats wouldn't be sitting there today. It would be a parliament full of independence-minded politicians. And had that happened, then we would be well on the road to independence now, and not going through this ridiculous charade of the Supreme Court.
Basically, every list would be pro-independence. You'd have a couple of Tories down the borders, and you'd have a couple of Lib Dems up the top end, and that would be it. You might have a Labour in Glasgow, I think, but I mean, it would have been a handful. And so, if you could replicate that would crack it.
And when you speak to SNP people now about, right, are you pleased that you both vote SNP? Oh, well, we made a
Because
mistake.
they got over 1 million votes and 2 seats.
It was, oh yeah, we made a mistake, we'll get it right next time. The whole system, the DeHaan system, was made so that there would never be an overall majority, because Westminster obviously didn't want that to happen. But Alex Salmond, like him or not, he is a brilliant strategist. And when he was the First Minister, he ended up with a majority of an overall majority for the SNP of 4, and because he knew how to work the system or outwit Westminster when it came to the votes, and that's why he was saying vote, one. Well, for us it was vote Alba, then SNP, but all sorts of. If we just all voted for independence parties, and that would have cleared, 30 seats.
That would be like a 3/4 majority.
And so now, people like me and you, I'm dreading the next election. I really am, because I don't know if I can hold my nose and vote SNP. But, we're seriously going to have to think about it, because, the focus is let's get over the bloody line and get independence. And some of us are going to have to do some really unpalatable things just to get over the line.
Okay, we'll leave it at that for the time being. I just got unfortunately, Tim Rideout will not be able to join us this afternoon. He had a problem with his car. So it'll be myself talking about EFTA, and anybody else who wants to intervene on I might be intervening on a couple of different subjects, but we'll keep the discussion going in any case. So thank you very much, and we'll be back in half an hour. Welcome to this second part of our discussion here with the SSRG. And today I'd like, at this point, I'd like to speak about, first of all, we're going to speak about EFTA and the EEA relative to EU, relative to the EU. I'll give a presentation of the way I view it. We'll ask each of our other panelists to give their view, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Then we were supposed to have Tim Rideout here to talk about currency. He couldn't make it. I'll suggest what I can about currency and what I see it. You all can intervene, and then of course others can intervene as well. So the question of the EU relative to EFTA. Now, this is a issue that's been very present for me as I live in France. I was I'm a UK citizen, and when the Brexit vote came through, and when the UK removed itself from the EU, I was deprived of certain rights. It wasn't tremendously impactful on my life in the sense that I was able to get a carte de séjour, whereas before, my British passport was enough. After that, I have to register every 10 years to have the right to stay. It's not a big deal. For me personally. Also, I can no longer vote at the local level and the European level. As living in France, and I'm not a French citizen, so I could not vote in either the presidential elections or in the French parliamentary elections. So, you know, that said, those were the only, and I can no longer go and work in other European countries. You know, one of these 4 freedoms was removed from me as a UK citizen. And so, again, it doesn't affect me that much. I probably could get French citizenship if I wanted to. It's a long process. But just to say my own personal experience with that, but there are other people who were affected much more gravely, and they had to, you know, they may not have had the right to live and work in France, and of course that's the case all over the EU. But it was in this context, of course, that Scotland did vote to remain in the EU, and they were removed from the EU without, you know, against the democratic will, and that was supposed to, at one time, be a sufficient reason for Scotland to become independent. But we saw the negotiations, we saw the removal of UK from the EU, and we're still, you know, Scotland's still part of the UK and not part of the EU. And what's also been notable is the debate that's going on over the EU and whether, and it's been, I realize it's been SNP policy to get back into the EU, you know, once independence is achieved. But how that happens is really complicated. I mean, you know, and from what I've seen, we had Nicola Sturgeon, her intervention a few weeks ago, where she said, okay, we want to have this currency and we want to get back into the EU. And then the thing is that sets it up so that, you know, the unionist papers and others can say, what about this? What about that? How are you going to get through that? You got Spain, they're going to veto it. All of these things, these tropes that we've heard for years, saying, oh well, your little dream of getting back into the EU, there's no way. Now, when almost exactly 2 years ago, when I set up when I started talking with David Henry, we formed the SSRG, and prior to the 2021 election, we contacted EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, and I asked them specifically, what if the Scottish government or the Parliament, if they used the 2021 elections as a plebiscite for independence, would that be sufficient for Scotland to join EFTA? And they said, yeah, basically. They under their treaties, it's completely different from the EU. In the EU, there's a long accession process. There's the convergence criteria. You have to have your debt to GDP ratio and a deficit to GDP ratio at a certain level, and then maybe you can get in. And then you have to, you have all these other countries that are humming and hawing about whether, and then ultimately they do, countries do have a veto. Now, the way I understand it, it's not so much that countries would veto, say no way, I'm not going to, Spain say, we're worried about Catalonia, so we're going to veto Scotland's entry. It's more consensus. It's more that the countries, the EU countries get together and they agree on a path forward. And it may be that certain countries may, be able to veto it, but there's also countervailing pressures against them if they did veto it. What would that mean? And are they standing in the way of, whatever they want to do, and are they going to, possibly, go against the current of opinion in vetoing, Scottish, for example, Scottish accession. But I spoke with EFTA, Mr. Omarsson from EFTA, and I asked him, and he said that under the treaties, any state can apply to join. And it's not specific about what a state is, and it doesn't have to be, again, it's vague. And under the treaty, but the main thing is that the main criteria, the only one that Scotland lacks For example, earlier, I believe it was the 1953 Montevideo Convention, and they defined what a state is. And a state has to have a geographically defined border, a people, a nation, a people, if you will, and that is able to govern itself, and that they're able to conduct international relations. That's the only criteria that Scotland, at least in theory, lacks. That Scotland cannot make treaties with other countries because they're not the nation state. Only, at this point, the UK is the nation state, so they can't do that. The Scotland can't, sign treaties because they're not recognized as an independent nation state. But EFTA was very open, as long, and according to EFTA, as long as this country, of course in this case Scotland, has the powers to negotiate treaties and the powers to abide by them, there's no problem. So as long as you can sign the EFTA treaties and your parliament or whatever government has the powers to abide by the treaties, there's no problem. They were not precise about, you have to do this, you have to do this. They were much more open. And so, and it could be done very, very rapidly. When I talked to him, I said, so what would be the procedure? And he said, well, if in 2021 if the election is a plebiscite election, and they say if we get a pro-independence majority, we're proclaiming independence. If that had happened, then immediately they would have sent a letter to the EU Council. The EFTA Council. They would have at the next monthly meeting, they would have considered it, and then I have no doubt that if he said this to me, that he would have had the agreement, or that he would have checked this with his his colleagues before that. And then, so that gets into EFTA, but that's different from being back in the single market, or what's called the EEA, the European Economic Area. Now, what is also called the single market. And so the EEA is composed of all of the European members, the members of the EU, plus the 3 of the 4 EFTA members, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland, that are also members of the EEA. Switzerland is a part of EFTA, but they're not in the EEA, and it's really complicated. They have all these bilateral agreements. They're in the single market technically, but it's dependent on all of these different bilateral agreements that they have in the EU. Recently, they were trying to negotiate a new treaty to kind of encompass all of it. They didn't manage to get consensus, so the old treaties still apply, but it's much, much simpler to be in the EEA. There's no question about it. And they said that after Scotland was accepted into EFTA at their next monthly meeting, we're not talking years, we're not talking 5 years, we're not talking 10 years, we're talking like weeks. And then after that, the 3 members of the EEA, who are also meeting members of EFTA, again, the EFTA members excluding Switzerland, would unite, and at the next monthly meeting of the EEA Council, they would, as a unit, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland would propose that Scotland be readmitted to the EEA. And he said, I foresee no problem in this. He said, I can't imagine a difficulty. And so if this course had been taken, Scotland could have been in the EEA for well over a year. It could have happened last summer, a summer a year ago, if they had taken the course of action that the SSRG had put into their manifesto for India. So we are where we are. Now, what is the difference between EEA, EFTA, and the EU? Now, I'm sure you're aware of many of the things I'm going to say, but as you know, they were different. They've been different institutions that have evolved especially since the Second World War. Now, after the Second World War, there was the idea, well, let's not go to war again. And so one of the first things that they did was, I believe it was France and Germany formed the steel and iron community. You know, the idea that there would be a union of industry so that not one country could start like arming itself and building tanks and all that without other people, other being aware of it. So, and that evolved. I've got a timeline here. I'm not going to go too much into it, but you had the 48, the Treaty of Brussels establishing the Western Union. 1951, the Treaty of Paris creates the coal and steel community, and then since then you've had a series of treaties. The Dunkirk Treaty 47, Brussels 48, London and Washington Treaties 49, Paris. All the way over the years since then, which have been, negotiations to integrate further and further the different countries into the EU. And I believe that, the Maastricht Treaty was probably the most significant. Where that opened up the freedom of movement, what they call the four freedoms of movement: freedom of movement of capital, goods, services, and people. So that if you live in Finland, you can go live and work in Portugal, or if you're in Spain, you can go live and work in Ireland. And it was a wonderful thing, and it's one of the reasons I came, because I was able to get, and when I was living in the U.S. in the early 90s, I said, oh yeah, I heard about the EU, and I was able to get UK citizenship through my father, and then that meant I can live and work in France. It's great, and so you had those four freedoms that underpin the European Union, but at the same time, you had the formation of EFTA in 1960, and then the original EFTA members in 1960 were Austria, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, and Sweden, Switzerland, and the UK to further integrate their economies. Finland becomes an associated member of EFTA in 1961. Iceland becomes a member of EFTA in 1970, and so again, you can go on the internet and get these timelines and see more for yourself. But the main point being that they are parallel institutions, and there are reasons why the EFTA members don't want to become part of the EU, and there are reasons why former EFTA members, including the United Kingdom, became members of the EU. Now, the main difference, and the principal difference, is that as I said, it's much easier to get into EFTA than it is in the EU. And second of all, what the terms of that are. Now, EFTA members are obliged to respect the four freedoms that I just mentioned: the freedom of movement of goods, people, capital, and services. Okay? So, if Scotland becomes a member, they have to respect that. So, if you want to go live and work in Finland or Portugal or wherever, you can, because you're obliged to respect that. Also, the EU programs, Erasmus research programs, all of these things that Scotland benefited from before as part of the EU. Scotland could choose basically a la carte. As long as you pay into this program, you can participate in it. Erasmus is a perfect example where as long as you pay into the program, then you can obviously participate in it. But it's up to the country to decide whether or not to participate. But what is, I don't know, what could be problematic is the customs union. Now, the customs union, as when Scotland was in the EU, they were in the customs union and they were in the single market. Now, and the single market is more to do with, regulations, minimum standards for labor, for products, these types of things. which of course getting back in the EEA would do that, but it's different from the customs union, because the customs union is because the EFTA members are able to negotiate bilateral treaties with whoever they want. Okay, so that could be, in theory, against, if you have this customs union, and then you've got countries making bilateral agreements with other countries, then that could be problematic for them. However, Turkey, for example, is in the customs union and is neither part of the EFTA or the EU. But as far as I understand, they're able to do bilateral agreements with other countries, but it has to conform to the it can't be in contradiction to the customs union. So it's perfectly possible. I mean, if and hopefully when Scotland does become a member of EFTA, they can get back into the EEA, and there's no reason they can't ask the European Commission to get into the customs union as well. There may be certain conditions applied to that. If Scotland negotiates with some other country, some kind of bilateral trade agreement, it may have to be in conformity with the customs union or with the EU. There may be some kind of rules around that. You couldn't do a free trade agreement that would violate the customs union, but it's possible. And it's a question of, because you often hear, oh, well, if you're in this, you can't be in that, and if you're in that, you can't be part of that. And there are certain, that is true to an extent, but also, becoming an EFTA member will enable Scotland to build their own, kind of economic system, including their own currency, and not be subject to the requirements of EU entry. Now, and so imagine there's some democratic event in which Scotland, becomes independent, whether it be through a referendum, through a plebiscitary election, whatever. Then very quickly they can get in. Scotland can get into the EEA, can petition to get part of the customs union, and be and have a certain economic stability to it. And then there's no reason that they couldn't apply for EU membership after. As I said before, there are several countries, Portugal, and numerous other countries that formed EFTA that moved on to the EU, after their accession process. So there's nothing, oh, it has to be either or. It's not the case. It's up to the individual country to decide for themselves individually what relationship they want to have. It's just like that, you decide what relationships you want to have with them. It's the same with the EU. It's not like this cookie cutter thing, or it's either this or that. Every country has their own situation that Scotland cannot construct at this point because part of the UK. But once becoming independent and in at least the short term, becoming part of EFTA would at least get Scotland back into the single market, be able to trade again, and then see over time whether EU membership is a good idea or not. So Scotland, has a democratic event affirming peaceful and democratic support for independence. Then they hopefully able to quickly get into EFTA, EEA. And then apply for EU membership, and at the same time establishing, setting up a Scottish currency, and which they need to do anyway, even to apply for the EU. You can't apply for the EU if you have a currency that's outside of that. And it doesn't mean that they absolutely have to adopt the euro. That's another thing that is false. From what I understand, they have to commit. Any country that's applying to the EU has to commit to adopting the euro, but we see like Sweden and other countries are part of the EU but haven't adopted the currency. And it takes a long time. You have to you have to conform to all these convergence criteria. And basically, it's not an absolute requirement to get into the EU. And so my point is that EFTA membership can happen relatively rapidly. Weeks rather than months, and I'm really not sanguine at all about EU membership in any kind of time span that's even remotely envisageable. You've got all these barriers. Oh, you have to adopt this currency, you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to reapply. What about Spain and all this? And I don't know what. And the EU, I just don't think it's a really cool place to be right now. They got all kinds. With Hungary, and and they're talking about bringing Ukraine in, and so I think in my view, and that's what the SSRG has proposed, is that the EFTA membership, rapidly is, and all Scotland lacks as a country, as a nation, is the capacity to sign and negotiate and abide by international treaties. We don't have that power yet as part of the UK. But again, EFTA is pretty irreligious or very non-dogmatic on what that actually means, and again, it's very, I think it wouldn't necessarily need to be a referendum in order for that to occur. It seems to me as if it's not only the Scottish government, but they're so set on, we have to have a referendum to get international legitimacy so that other countries will recognize it. They do that all the time. And in the communications we've had with other countries, like, just go for it, man. What are you waiting for? We'll recognize you, but Scotland has to do it first. They can't do it for Scotland. It has to be, they have to make the first move. And again, it doesn't have to be a referendum. There are other perfectly legitimate, democratic means to achieve independence, whether it be through a plebiscitary referendum and all that other countries will probably recognize. But there has to be outreach, there has to be communication, there has to get in touch with these countries. And say, this is what we're doing, this is the situation we're in. Would you consider recognizing us if we did this in order to affirm peacefully and democratically support for independence? A lot of countries are open to that. In conclusion, EFTA membership, at least in the short term, it can be achieved within 2 or 3 months maximum, as long as there's goodwill, which there is. It will get Scotland back into the single market, and it will enable. I've seen on debates online. The EU is not going to like it if you join EFTA. It's one or the other. And and looking at all of the countries that were in EFTA and went to the EU, why not? And I think EFTA is 4 members. So the only thing to join, you send a letter asking acceptance, and then to leave, you send another letter, and then over a year you wrap up the loose ends and you're gone. It's not like, you have to commit to this, you have to commit to that. No. We see all the countries that have gone from EFTA to the EU. So it can be done, but it's a question of just doing the work, negotiating, talking to them, having the relationship with them. And there's no reason why Scotland can't join EFTA, buy into the programs that it wants to, and then apply for EU membership, and then you negotiate the terms of it. At that point, they say, okay, there's a referendum. Do you want to remain in EFTA or join the EU? Straight enough forward. And then, but it can be done in a relaxed fashion. It's not like, we got to join the EU. We got to get back in the single market. Whatever terms, we'll take it. We don't care. Just get us back in the EEA or the single market. Whereas Scotland could be in the single market. Maybe let's talk. What are you willing to propose? What will be the terms? And do it, as we say in French, tranquillement, tranquil, not under duress, not under this idea that you have to get into the EU as quickly as possible to get back into the EEA. It's more that Scotland can do it in a relaxed fashion and say, well, maybe staying in EFTA is better after. And there's the other, the idea that I've heard from many pro-EU people who want Scotland to go back is that, well, Scotland, in EFTA, Scotland would be a rule taker, not a rule maker. And that's something that's often heard. And while Scotland and EFTA members would not have a formal role in writing or in EU law, under the treaties, any EU law which touches on the cooperation that they have, because basically EFTA and the EU, they cooperate on economics, the four freedoms, the single market, but not all of the other areas that the EU has treaties under. But if there is a law that the EU is passing that touches on the areas of shared competence, then the EU has to submit that law to EFTA for them to consider. They can't block it, but they do have a role in giving input on how that law would affect them. What do they have to say about it? Maybe propose some amendments. And so they do have a role, maybe not a formal role. They can't vote on it. They can't dictate it, but they can give their input and say, well, this wouldn't work that well. This law, maybe you could change it this way. Maybe you could change it that way. So, and that's in the treaties. The EU has to submit these laws to EFTA basically for their feedback, and that may or may not lead to changes in the law, but it's part of the treaty. So I think that in the view of the SSRG, it can be achieved rapidly. It would get Scotland back into the single market. The customs union, you just have to ask. What would and it's the European Commission which oversees the customs union. And if Scotland made approaches, say, hey, we'd like to become a customs union. What do we need to do? All right, okay, if we negotiate free trade agreements with other countries, what conditions would we, as members of the customs union, be obliged to consider? But it's up there to be crafted. It's up there to be negotiated and discussed. But it's not this kind of automatic thing. Oh, well, you're in this, you're not in that. Again, it can be, it's up for Scotland to create its own economic reality once it becomes independent. But obviously, independence is a prerequisite for anything. So, anyway. Would you like to speak a little bit about the EU or EFTA?
Really, what Mark said is that I think the overall of EFTA and EUA and the ISP, it was one of the main policies to be first put in place when the ISP was started up. And it was funny that the minute we put out about EFTA and EU and put out videos and really comprehensive information, that I got bombarded with people who knew that I voted to remain. Oh, but you remained, why are you wanting to go to EFTA and the EU? Well, that wasn't a choice. Why are you asking that ridiculous question in the first place? We only had a remain or leave. We didn't have a third option there. At that time, there was only two options. Scotland does have other options when we become an independent country. And whenever that might well be, we will become an independent Scotland because I think we've got the strength and the determination and the will to keep fighting for it. We have to show people vision, and it's not all this or that. You have to show people vision, and when you see the options there for EFTA and the EEA, then people can be enlightened to another variant, another direction, another prospect Now, look where we are with Brexit at the present moment. Our social care and social work department is on its knees. The people we relied on to look after our disabled and our elderly all went away because they were told they weren't welcome anymore. So they went away, quite rightly so. Why would you stay in a country you felt that you weren't welcome in? Your work ethic, and they have good work ethic, wasn't acknowledged and it wasn't appreciated. You've got the NHS, our hospitals, again, on its knees, because we don't have the workforce. Yes, there's other complexities there because of pay deals, the actual terms and conditions of their employment within the NHS, I understand that. But again, a lot of the staff that were within the NHS, and whether that's nurses, doctors, auxiliaries, people who worked in the kitchens, porters, hospitals in the NHS isn't just about your doctors and nurses, it's a team. There's people behind the scenes that nobody really thinks about, and they were a lot of the EU citizens that fled from this country because they felt, well, it's not going to be here anymore, I'm going back home. I've got a friend that works in one of the biggest hospitals here in Glasgow, and they are literally mentally and physically drained, not just because of COVID, and that rightly so, but in her ward alone, she's got one nurse where she should have 6. And that's just one aspect of that ward, the running of that ward. She's a carcass, she's handing out, she's actually having to hand out lunches and gather up the lunch dishes. Now, that's not in her salary scale, that's not what she gets paid for. But that's what it's coming down to, because they don't have the staff. We have to look at what Scotland could gain from being with EFTA and then joining the EA to be free-flowing, to bring back people into this country that can have economic good, and they feel as if they're doing something good for the country as well as us prospering from their work ethic. We've just shown that whether it's people don't want to work because of the pay or the terms and conditions, they do. And they've got a barrier as big as a wall. They just can't get through it. So we need to show people other options. So the ISP have always been in favour. If and when we become an independent Scotland, that's definitely what we are going to be promoting, is to join EFTA with the EEA. Because again, as Mark says, it's a lot quicker, it's a lot less rubbish with paperwork and all the rest of it that you have to go through. We can join it really, really quickly and get things started and actually get this economy of Scotland flowing again, because we're damn well needing it done quick.
I really can only chuckle my own tuppence first, because you've actually more or less said it all already. The couple of points I would make. Full European Union membership bluntly isn't an option in any reasonable time scale. So it's not something that we really need to get too frantic about. And for what it's worth, I was deeply upset when we came out of the European Union with the Brexit thing, and I would much rather just have stayed in there. But it's not an option to get back in any reasonable time scale. And since we came out and watching developments in the EU, they're not necessarily things that, we try and focus on things that have happened. Maybe, Ukrainian membership, I think, is not, Ukraine would like to be in. I don't see it happening just instantly. But basically it's not an option. EFTA is just really a no-brainer. It's just so stark staring obvious that when, and I hope it is when Scotland gets independence, you would be completely welcome. And the only comment I would make, and it's not really relevant because they can do what they like, but I'd be very surprised if EFTA accepted residual United Kingdom as a member, because they would be accepting something like 55 million people who consistently vote for extremely hard-right governments, who believe that there were 9 German bombers in the sky in the RAF from England shot them down, who have extremely divisive politicians. And I think that if you were the remaining members, Norway, Liechtenstein, Iceland, and by that time Scotland, you might look around and say, I don't really want this big bruiser in my club, thank you. So I think but that's not our problem, although it would be our problem if we stayed part of the UK and the UK started wanting to join with all 60 million of us. So EFTA really is as I say, I think a no-brainer. I think that I'd add to what Colette's been saying about the lack of employment. I mean, it's not just health. I mean, I live in Argyll, and there are shops. There's the Open chocolate shop, the fish and chip shops. They're only opening about 4 days a week because they haven't got staff. But it's worse than that. I mean, since we had freedom of movement in Europe, a city like Glasgow has become astonishingly more interesting. You know, it's culturally absolutely full of people from all over, and we need more people in Scotland. Our big problem is that our 5 million are like me, they're getting older and older and older, and the ones that are coming in tend to be sort of rich incomers who just I mean, okay, they bring the money in, they sell a small house down there. I'm not anti-English, but it's rather unfortunate that we bring in people who need health services and social care, who don't really have the ability to contribute a great deal. I'm not anti-English. I mean, during the lockdown, we've actually had people in the area where I live who've moved into their holiday houses during lockdown, and they've now been sold up down south, and they are actually working, and their kids are in local schools, and I think that's fantastic. But we need an awful lot more people in Scotland to make the go of it, and without really opening up our borders, there's really no way of achieving that. So it has to be EFTA, because for all the reasons Mark has outlined, EU membership, you have to decide if you wanted to vote for it. As a post-independent Scotland needs to decide by political parties putting it on their manifestos, and then they would need to start negotiating. I think it could be achieved, but it would not be achieved in any great hurry. I don't think EFTA, someone once said that EFTA would object to sort of parking there, sort of squatting there while you waited for EU.
Stepping stone.
It has happened in the past that Sweden passed through and other countries have passed through, so I don't think we'll be too fussy about that. But it's really got to be EFTA. So end of, I think.
Okay, any questions about EFTA? Yes, go ahead. Just one second. I'll get the microphone.
The usual suspect.
Should independent Scotland hold a referendum before we join EFTA, the customs union, or the EU?
Sorry,
Should an independent Scotland have a referendum before we join EFTA or the EU?
in my view, I think that EFTA should be automatic that, and proposed that if there is a vote or affirmation that there will be EFTA first, because it'll get Scotland rapidly back into the single market, etc. Later there can be but later there can be a referendum on, once there's been negotiations with the EU about possible membership, then there should be a referendum as to whether to remain in the EU, remain in EFTA, or join the EU. That's the way I view it. I can't dictate anything, of course, but because EFTA is much easier to join, it's easier to withdraw. There aren't all of these onerous conditions and vetoes of different. There's 4 countries, not 27, that have to be in agreement, and it just seems like a much more laid-back club to be in. Again, at least in the short term, and remaining outside of that, of the EEA particularly, and things degrade even more and more, and especially not having freedom of movement to where people from Europe can come and live and work in Scotland without being hunted down by the Home Office. That will do tremendous benefits to the economy.
Question.
I would like to ask the panel's opinion on whether we see EFTA or the EEA as the end, or needs to the end of full joining the full EU.
Yeah, sure. Well, I've kind of sort of partly answered that, but I just very quickly go on to the point we just made just now. I disagree with Mark on the EFTA being an automatic consequence of Scottish independence, because I would like the independence, there would have to be some kind of referendum. I'd like it to be just a straight independence or not. And then, depending on what happens, one of the numerous things that we've been talking about elsewhere, and we'll maybe come back to it, is what a constitution for Scotland would look like. Because if you gather from what I said this morning, I quite like constitutions. And something that would be structured into a constitution would be the extent to which you have referendums. And obviously we all know that Switzerland has referendums just about every couple of weeks on all sorts of topics, and everyone's used to them. So I think these are things that need to be sorted out. But whether you went for, the situation is going to be people are not going to vote against EFTA membership, but they have to be given a choice. We cannot continue to go down the route of messing around with different topics. As I said this morning, SNP should be independence only. Independence-minded parties should be independence only, and then sort out. Once you've got your independence, sort it out from there. The other thing is whether I personally think that we go from EFTA to EU. I don't know. I felt comfortable with the United Kingdom being in the EU. I could travel about, got friends over here, this, that and the other thing. I enjoyed it. It's not an option because of the time scale involved. So I would kind of suspend judgment on it. I would say you've got no choice, so you might as well go for EFTA. See how you get on, and then you would have another referendum. So you would actually have a couple of referenda. You would have one immediately probably on EFTA, and then further down the road, you see how the EU was going. We also want to think to be talking about currency, and that's an interesting one because personally I'd probably be quite comfortable with the euro or whatever, which is another separate discussion. Do you want to talk about currency this afternoon?
I'm going to touch on that. I won't be able to speak about it when the authority gets it right out. Okay. Do you want to give it in?
Anyone else have any questions? We're going to discuss currency now. So we've transported the spirit of Tim Ryder into Ewen here. So it's not really him speaking, it's Tim speaking through him.
Dr. Tim here. I've got a...
Has anyone ever seen Blue Peter? Here's one we produced earlier.
I've got a euro groat or a pound. What's the Scottish pound to sell you? Right. I'm not an expert on this, but I'll just say very briefly. I think that at the time of 2014 referendum, it would have been very beneficial for residual England if Scotland had kept the pound. I think it was a serious mistake tactically, because it enabled George Osborne and others to start screaming, well, that means we'll still be in control. But when you think that one of the main features, now personally I'd like the oil to stay under the ground. That's my personal choice. But if you talk to any, I don't talk to American multimillionaire billionaires, but if you see them talking on Twitter or whatever, they say that the pound without the backing of oil would sink even further than we're showing now. So, 2014 situation, Scotland was saying something that was really very beneficial for England, and England was using it to spit in Scotland's face and say, well, we'll control the whole show and we're not letting you use it. Well, of course they couldn't stop us using it, but they told us a lot of other lies at the same time as well. So you move on. It leaves you with no choice. Well, it does leave you with a bit of a choice. You can automatically set up your own currency, and I think that would be what I would feel was essential. The other possibility, and I'm not Tim Rideout, so I'm not qualified to discuss this in any detail, but is whether you would have a really serious look at the euro, because the euro, it sounds to me that unionists have been screaming at the euro for years, and sometimes if you give something a bad name, it kind of sticks. And I would certainly prefer to see a sort of properly balanced discussion about the euro before I personally was convinced about what we should be doing. So, leaving that on the back burner for the moment, a Scottish currency, the risk I think it would run would be that it could actually end up being an incredibly hard currency. Leaving aside the oil, there's a huge amount of renewables here, and it's a sick joke to say, but it's probably the truth. Some distance down the line, someone's going to run out of water, and there's going to be another country quite close to them that's got a hell of a lot of water. This morning was anything to look like. But I'm actually not joking, because I think that we have to look at the incredibly large seabed that we have. I'll take a very small detour and tell you that one of my interests living in the countryside is I'm very interested in the fishing industry, and I'm very interested in what happens with our water. And it's not just fishing, we have a gigantic national asset. Our biggest common good is the seabed. It's absolutely massive, and unfortunately it is very, very seriously under threat just now. It's under threat from massive super trawlers who are just doing what they want, and dare I say it, it's also under threat from things like the aquaculture industry, where you have Norwegian multinationals, Norwegian-owned Icelandic-owned companies coming in and doing with our water what they're not allowed to do back home. And in areas which are already actually very short of labour, they come in and they say, well, we're creating employment, but it's actually people we need. Because as I said earlier, there's so many industries that are completely starved of people. There's a lot of the fishing industry, the boats are laid up. There was about 6 boats laid up a year ago, partly COVID, but mainly Brexit in Oban. And there's guys I know who are coming out of fishing. There's a hell of a lot we can do. So what I'm really saying is we've got some phenomenal assets. And I think the currency, if we had a Scottish currency, and also of course there's national debt, how much of UK debt, we should only take it on if we get some assets for it. And particularly if residue UK is going to be really rough about the thing, we say, well, I'm sorry, you are the residual country, you've got the debt, pal. You know, I've left home and I've left my bank card with my mum, and I've got a new bank card and it's got no debt on it. So the risk would really be that a Scottish currency could be a hell of a hard currency like Norway's is. But you can manage that. You manage that with intelligent economic planning. Just make it very expensive for people to come and have a holiday here. But others know more about this technically than I do, but that's my take on it anyway.
Yeah. I'm largely in complete agreement. Tim Rideout he's given lots of different talks throughout and I'm sure you can find plenty of them online, but he's able to simplify it in a way. You know, the adoption of a currency, what the steps that you go through, you use them both you use pound sterling and that in parallel, and then you phase in. It's not like one day it's there and one day it's a new currency. It's a phased process where you can have both. You could have accounts in pound sterling and a Scottish pound. And if you go to Northern Ireland, especially on the border, you can pay in pounds or euros or whatever. I mean, it's not like there's any technological impediment to adopting, to using two currencies at the same time, and then more and more phasing in of the Scottish currency. I think one of the main points that, if I remember correctly, that one of the conditions, one of the things that needs to happen when a Scottish currency is introduced is that all taxes have to be paid in Scottish currency. You could of course do transactions. Maybe you have your mortgage in pound sterling. There's no reason you can't continue to do that for a while. But then, of course, over time, you're able to be replaced. Maybe the euro would be something that could be adopted in the future. I don't know. It's completely up in the air. But a Scottish currency is necessary in any case, even if you want to credibly apply for EU membership. Scotland can't be using the pound sterling. And maybe they could start some kind of negotiation process with the EU, but they couldn't actually get into the EU. Scotland couldn't get into the EU unless it had its own, a distinct currency. And so you see, in Iceland and all of the EFTA countries have their own currency. The krona in Norway. I'm not sure about Iceland, but of course Swiss franc or Swiss franc. But anyway, but they have their own currency as well. And so it's just it's like EFTA. It's a no-brainer, and it would be a prerequisite in any case to achieving EFTA or EU membership as well. I'm not sure about EFTA and whether Scotland could keep the currency. The pound sterling. I don't know, but certainly for EU membership, it would be necessary to have your currency.
How difficult is it to set up your own currency?
I so wish. I wish Tim was here. He gave an excellent presentation at our conference. It's not the way he explains it. He simplifies it. He demystifies it, and it's not that difficult.
Can I just
please go ahead. I'm sure you know more than I do.
Tim came and did a presentation for SSRG in Glasgow a few months ago, and he has a very detailed plan for it, down to how many days and weeks it takes from the date they're going to do that. The one thing people should remember about currency, the value of the currency comes down to what exactly are you trading that people want to buy. Therefore, they need your currency. So since Scotland exports more than it imports, and England imports more than it exports, then Scotland's currency is likely to be more valuable than England's currency. We're not going to sell oil, gas or renewable electricity unless you pay us in our currency. That is where the value underlines the value of your currency. So people shouldn't be afraid of their own currency. And you've mentioned on it, but it's actually very important. To join the EU, to even apply, you must have control over your own currency. The SNP's policy is not competent. They can't apply to rejoin the EU because they don't have a currency. You can't use another country's currency and claim to be able to control it and join the EU. Previously, the SNP's policy, when we were still in the EU, made sense because we were part of the UK and we were part of the EU. But we're not part of the EU anymore. And so it's a nonsense to say that you can join the EU quickly. You can't. You have to have control of your currency. We're going to have a currency. You could use the euro. But that's probably only going to happen after about 5 years anyway, because you've got to join the EU first. That takes 5 years to do. Yes.
If you use another country's currency, there's no way you can claim to be independent. We do not want to be ruled by the Bank of England.
Agreed.
Yeah, exactly.
Colette, did you want to?
No, I was just going to say that exact point about England and the Bank of England. That, right now we're being told by the Scottish Government that we will stay with the sterling, pound sterling, until whenever possible we can then have our own currency. There's no definition of time there. It's like, oh well, whenever. We need to know, because look at what's happening just now. Look what Liz Truss just done in 1 week. You know, what she done for the economy in 1 week. Can you imagine if we became an independent Scotland and we are governed by the Bank of England and the Tories or whoever are still in, they could do real detrimental damage to us as a country and our economy because of what they're doing with their English pound. So we need to, why things, you know, I mean, there's places like the SSRG, we've got Coatbridge, we've got all these other groups that have been talking about currency, etc. for many, many years. Why, we need a transition period. Why has this not been worked on over the past 8 years since we lost the last independence referendum? Why has this not been worked on? Why do we always wait to the last minute and we still don't have the proper answers from the Scottish Government? Because people are worried, and especially right now, when people are worried about paying their bills, whether it's gas, electricity, or now their mortgages, or whether they're going to have a job next week. Why do we always wait to the last possible minute, and people are uncertain? Because people need certainty, people need reassurance, and especially right now, they are really worried about their own financial household bills. Never mind a whole Scotland country bills, and where the export money's coming in or the import money. To them, that's way over the hedge right now. They're wanting to know how they're going to, one, have their own job, earn their own salary, pay their bills. They need to have certainty, and we need to give them answers that yes, and again in 2014, the nonsense that was told to pensioners about you're going to lose your pension. For goodness sake, the UK's got the 29% of your annual income you get as a pensioner. For God's sake, we're the lowest pension providers in the whole of the whole of Europe. For goodness sake, we can't do much worse than coming to an independent Scotland and having our own social security system. So we need clarity, but we don't need this, well, we'll just join at the most convenient point. That we need a time frame here. People need to see there is a pathway and a certainty. So yeah, we need to get that sorted out, and that's when the Scottish Government really should be looking at the SSRG and Commonwealth and all the other think tanks and sit round the table and get some clarity for us who are the sovereign nation. We're the sovereign citizens of Scotland. We have a say and we should know exactly what we're heading into.
They just need to ask their own member to invite out instead of all laid out date by date.
Exactly.
How they adopt their own.
Absolutely. We need people like to see a time frame. They like to see certainty. There's so much uncertainty just now. Whether we're in Scotland or whether you're in England or Northern Ireland, there's just too much uncertainty throughout the political spectrum. We need clarity, and this, well, whatever, that's not going to wash, I'm sorry, that's not going to get you an independent cross on the ballot paper. It's just not going to happen. We need clarity.
Yep. More questions from the audience? All right, so thank you all for coming.
Thank you
Really
for
really
that.
enjoyed it. I hope that you took from what we're speaking, but certainly EFTA is an important getting back into the single market is extremely important. Setting up your own currency, a Scottish currency is very important. Again, I wish we had Tim Wright out because he could explain it much more clearly than we could. But I hope that it's been food for thought and we can continue with the quest.